In 1941, America was sending millions of its citizens to fight a war on the far side of the world, across frozen tundra and into sweltering jungles. But they had a catastrophic problem. They had nowhere for them to live. Ships could carry rifles and tanks, but not whole towns. Lumber and brick took too long to build on site, and canvas tents left men exposed to artillery shrapnel, monsoons, and Arctic cold. So the question facing planners was simple and brutal. How do you build a city for an army, overnight, anywhere on Earth? This is the story of the unexpected answer. 1,941 America shifts from peacetime to full-scale mobilization, and nothing about the country stays the same. Men and women are recruited, factories retool overnight, and convoys load up for oceans they've never crossed. Ships, tanks, and planes dominate the headlines, but the real story is logistical. Millions of people will be uprooted and sent to every climate on Earth. Ports swell with crates, rail yards hum. Training camps spring up like temporary towns. The scale is almost unimaginable, and with it comes a brutal question. How do you house an army that has to live, fight, and survive anywhere it lands? Behind the grand strategy of tanks, planes, and battleships, a simple, critical vulnerability gapes wide. There was nowhere reliable for millions of men to sleep, eat, and recover. Battles are won with bullets, but sustained campaigns are won with roofs over heads, dry boots, and a place to patch a wound or write a letter home. Supply officers could route steel and fuel across oceans, but shelter? That turned out to be maddeningly hard, bulky, slow, and expensive to ship, or flimsy and exposed when you did send it. In short, the American war machine had everything except a practical way to house the people who made it move. The obvious answer was wooden barracks, but they were a logistical dead end. Heavy timber, skilled crews, and foundations that took weeks. You couldn't flatten a beam or cram a framed wall into a cargo crate. With ships, trains, and time already at a premium, bulky carpentry was a luxury the military couldn't afford. So planners had to look for something faster, packable, and field-ready. That left canvas tents cheap, light, and easy to throw over poles, but disastrously inadequate for a global war. A tent keeps out sunshine and a little breeze. It does not stop shrapnel, it does not hold up under a monsoon, and it turns into a wet, clammy coffin in a storm. Nights in canvas mean frozen limbs in the Arctic and sweltering misery in the Pacific. Seams gape, floors rot, vermin slip inside, and every gale turns sleeping men into exposed targets. In short, tents were an affront to mobility and morale, fine for campouts, ruinous for an army on the move. Tents weren't just uncomfortable, they were exposed. Canvas could be shredded by artillery shrapnel, offering no real barrier when rounds or fragments fell from the sky. Monsoon rains turned sleeping bags and uniforms into sodden weights, breeding disease and freezing morale. In the Arctic, a thin piece of fabric meant frostbite, hypothermia, and men so numb they couldn't fire a rifle. Equipment rusted, medical cases piled up, and simple tasks became dangerous chores. Small vulnerabilities multiplied into casualties and delays. What commanders saw on the ground was clear. Vulnerable shelter wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a crippling weakness that threatened operations. What started as a simple shelter problem soon ballooned into something much worse. Not just wet feet and sleepless nights, but gaps in readiness that could decide campaigns. Troops exposed to rain, mud, and cold got sick faster. Equipment corroded, supply lines slowed, and entire units lost precious days simply trying to stay alive instead of fighting. Ports and convoys became choke points when every crate of canvas and lumber mattered. Morale frayed. Plans that assumed steady quarters and quick turnarounds now counted on improvisation and luck. Suddenly, this was no longer a construction gripe. It was a strategic emergency that forced planners to rethink the basics of warfighting. The High Command understands a fundamental truth. An army exposed to the elements is an army that cannot fight effectively. Shelter isn't optional, it's strategy. Cold saps strength, rain ruins supplies, heat breeds illness. Men who sleep wet, who shiver through the night, who wake exhausted cannot hold a ridge or fix a plane. Suddenly, the problem stops being a housing nuisance and becomes a combat multiplier. Commanders start mapping roofs like they map artillery. Logistics officers stare at manifests and see not just tents, but lives. That realization turns a planning headache into a mission. Find a radically new kind of shelter fast. In 1941, the U.S. Navy, staring down the scale of global deployment, moved past hand-wringing and issued a formal mandate. Find a radically new shelter. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order that rippled through shipyards and design offices, turning a logistics headache into a wartime emergency. Engineers were told to think industrial, light, packable, and fast, to erect a shelter the Navy could manufacture and ship by the thousands. The Navy's demand was specific and daunting, a structure that could be mass-produced on an industrial scale. Not a bespoke shelter built by carpenters, not a canvas tent patched in the field. They wanted parts you could stamp out by the 1,000 panels and frames so uniform a factory line could churn them, crates that stacked neatly on freighters, and instructions, simple enough that a handful of enlisted men could bolt a building together with basic tools. It had to be cheap, durable, light, and idiot-proof. In short, they wanted architecture to behave like manufacturing, and that requirement would reshape every design choice that followed. The Navy's brief left no wiggle room. The shelter had to flatten like a deck of cards, fit into crates, and stack 3 decks deep in a Liberty ship. It had to be reproducible by the million, durable enough for typhoons and blizzards, but light enough for a single truckload. Most of all, it had to go from crate to roofline in a matter of hours, not days, not weeks, so men could land, unpack, and be under cover before nightfall. That constraint turned design into a logistics puzzle: simplicity, repeatability, and assembly by unskilled hands. This wasn't a luxury spec, it was a lifeline. Whatever they designed had to be so simple that a handful of soldiers with nothing but a wrench, a hammer, and a couple of tired hands could unpack it on a beach or an airstrip and have shelter by sunset. No cranes, no specialist crews, no complex blueprints. Think bolts that line up the same way every time, panels that slot together like a toy, instructions you could shout over the rain. That constraint reshaped everything. If the shelter couldn't be raised fast and by almost anyone, it wasn't worth shipping. Planners took that rule seriously and then started digging through old ideas for inspiration. They didn't start from scratch. Planners first scanned past solutions, and at the top of the list sat the British Nissen hut, a World War I semicircular corrugated steel shelter built for speed and thrift. Familiar, proven, and easy to ship, it looked like a natural candidate. It seemed like a shortcut. But when engineers looked closer, they began to see why it wouldn't be enough. They tested the obvious option, the old British Nissen hut, a proven idea from the last war, and it almost worked. But up close it fell apart. Too many parts, fiddly curved plates, bolts, and clips that demanded skilled crews and slow, careful assembly. It was fine for rebuilding a trench camp in peacetime. It was terrible for moving millions of men across oceans on tight timetables. America didn't need cleverness. It needed brute simplicity. Cheaper to stamp, faster to ship, quicker to raise. In short, The Nissen was the wrong tool for a machine war economy. A new solution was required. The immense task falls to the George A. Fuller Company, not an elite military contractor but a civilian construction firm suddenly thrust into the center of a global war effort, working hand in hand with the Navy at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. Overnight, they swap office routines for urgent war work, drawing up blueprints, testing steel, thinking about bolts and crates instead of marble facades. The pressure is immediate. Speed matters. Simplicity matters. Every decision will ripple across oceans. If they fail, thousands of men will be left in tents and mud. If they succeed, they'll give the Navy something nobody thought possible: a city you can pack, ship, and build anywhere. Their mission was brutally simple and impossibly broad: design a go-anywhere, build-anywhere shelter that checked every box the Navy had written down. It had to be cheap, standardized, and compact enough to stack on ships. It had to be assembled by a handful of men with basic tools in hours, not weeks. In short, it had to solve every climate, shipping, and speed problem at once, a near impossible paradox the designers now faced. The design brief demanded a near impossible paradox. A shelter so light it could be crated by the thousand, yet strong enough to carry a winter's weight of snow, airy and ventilated for Pacific heat, but rugged enough to shrug off a typhoon's fury. It had to pack flat, cross oceans, and be raised by handfuls of tired soldiers with nothing more than a wrench. No fancy foundations, no specialist crews. It had to be cheap, repeatable, and fast, an industrial product, not a one-off. Every requirement funneled the team toward one blunt conclusion: make it as simple as humanly possible. Above all else, the core principle guiding every decision was radical simplicity, not elegance, not novelty, but ruthless reduction to the essential. Every feature was measured against one question: does this add steps, parts, or training? If yes, cut it. Panels were made interchangeable. Fasteners were standard. Instructions were one page long. The frame had to be raised with a wrench and a hammer, not a crane. No fancy foundations, no custom pieces, no specialists. That constraint birthed clarity, a shelter so stripped down that it could be crated, shipped, and put up by rookies in a day, simple enough to win a war. They did what engineers do when the brief is impossible: strip everything down until only function remained. The result was brutally simple and quietly brilliant: a perfect half-cylinder of corrugated steel, mounted on a light but stiff steel frame. Curved panels shed rain and snow. Ribs give the shell strength without piles of lumber. Ends are nothing more than plywood discs with cutouts for doors and windows. No deep foundation, no fancy joinery, and so few parts a handful of men could bolt one together in hours. It wasn't pretty. It was fast, cheap, rugged, and exactly what the Navy had asked for. The half-cylinder's curved skin was simply capped off with plywood end walls cut to the arc, bolted in place, and punched with a door and a couple of windows. No fancy carpentry, no long waits. Those plain, serviceable ends let a small crew finish the shell in hours, weather-resistant enough to be useful and flexible enough for whatever the unit needed next. It needed no complex foundation. Crews could simply lay it on level ground or set it on a crude wooden floor. No costly masonry, no waiting for concrete to cure. It wasn't built to win beauty contests, it was built to work. Quick to ship, quick to raise, brutal in its honesty, and exactly the kind of shelter men needed yesterday. They named it for where it was born: Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and the plain, almost clumsy name stuck. Quonset Hut sounded less like a product and more like a promise. A compact, curving shelter you could ship by the crate, and stand up with a wrench and a couple of hands. The name traveled faster than marketing ever could. It became shorthand for practicality, for that ridged metal arc cutting across airfields, beaches, and muddy clearings. It didn't need charm. It needed a label, and that label carried the design out of the drawing board and into the field, ready for the first full prototype to be built in hours. The first prototypes are a stunning success. A full Quonset hut goes up in just under 6 hours by an inexperienced crew who'd never seen the plans before. No cranes, no specialist trades, just numbered panels, a handful of bolts, and grit. Men who'd spent months in foxholes stood back, incredulous, as a steel shell rose around them in a single day. The speed wasn't just impressive, it proved the whole idea, simple, repeatable, and portable, could actually scale, setting the stage for engineers to shrink the whole thing down for shipment. Then engineers proved something that turned the idea from clever to game-changing. A whole Quonset hut, disassembled, could be packed into a single crate only a few cubic meters in size. Picture those crates stacked on a transport, dozens of shelters per ship, steel ribs and corrugated panels nested like machine parts, efficient, predictable, and cheap to move. That tiny footprint rewired the logistics game. Factories could churn out identical kits by the million. Ports could load whole communities, and a handful of hands with a wrench could reassemble a town overnight. For the Navy, the question had finally been answered. Word of the prototype's success spread so fast, the Navy's phones light up. Then the first massive orders for thousands of huts roll into the Department of the Navy. Crates are requisitioned, specs stamped, and factories told to stop planning and start making. Rail cars are scheduled, assembly lines retooled, and a blueprint that once fit in a test field is about to be scaled to industrial thunder. Orders were no longer drawings on a desk, they became a national command. American factories, already gearing up for war, shifted into overdrive. Mills rolling corrugated steel, presses stamping identical arches, and lines of workers driving bolts by the thousand. Standardized panels, frames, and fasteners began pouring off the assembly lines by the million interchangeable pieces crated, stacked, and loaded onto ships in hours. The country bent its industrial muscle to one simple goal: turn raw metal into instant shelter, and in doing so transform ordinary factory floors into the backbone of a mobile, global infrastructure. It's the logic of the assembly line, Henry Ford's revolution applied to buildings instead of cars, and that change is quietly enormous. Panels stamped in identical rolls, frames punched out to exact specs, bolts counted and packed like spare parts. What used to be bespoke carpentry becomes predictable, repeatable, and fast. Standardization meant huts could be produced in bulk, crated without fuss, and assembled by unskilled hands, following a simple sequence. No more waiting on local craftsmen or complicated blueprints. Architecture turned into logistics, ready to be loaded onto ships and flown to wherever the war decided to go. By the time the U.S. Marines prepare to land at Guadalcanal in 1942, the first waves of Quonset huts are neatly crated and lashed to the decks of transport ships. American factories had been turning out corrugated panels and frames by the million, and those flat-packed kits now stacked like metal bread on every cargo hold. It wasn't just gear and guns crossing the ocean anymore, it was instant shelter, folded down to a few crates and a handful of bolts. Sailors and stevedores load them with the same urgency as ammunition. Soon, on newly taken beaches, those crates will be opened and entire steel towns will rise almost overnight. On newly captured islands, the difference was immediate. While enemy soldiers scrounged in dugouts and damp caves, American units unloaded crates and began erecting steel towns almost overnight. Panels clanged, bolts turned, corrugated shells rose in neat rows. In a matter of hours, camps, workshops, and clinics stood where there had been only sand and shell holes, organized, protected, and shockingly fast. Within days of a beachhead being secured, barren airstrips and muddy clearings sprout the distinctive curved shells of Quonset huts like metal cattails pushing up through the sand. Crates are hoisted off ships, panels click together, men working in tight, efficient teams, no cranes, no red tape, just a choreography of wrenches and sweat. What had been a chaotic, raw shoreline becomes a tidy grid of steel arches, rows of quick shelter that turn an invasion zone into a functional, if improvised, town. Almost overnight, those curved shells proved their worth. What began as shelter became infrastructure. Command centers where officers hunched over maps and radio static, barracks stacked with cots, and the soft shuffle of exhausted feet. Mess halls where steaming rations were served under bare bulbs, low, echoing supply depots, crammed with crates of gear and fuel simple steel, doing every job the Army asked of it. They were repurposed almost overnight. Field hospitals stacked with cots and bandages, aircraft maintenance bays where engines were stripped and rebuilt, and, impossibly, little chapels where tired men gathered to pray. With a handful of bolts and some plywood, the same curved metal shell became ward, workshop, and sanctuary, practical, ugly, and unexpectedly humane. With just 6 to 8 soldiers and little more than a wrench and a hammer, an entire Quonset hut would rise in a day. Panels clicked into place, corrugated arches slotted over a simple frame, ends were bolted on. No cranes, no specialized crews, just muscle and method. By sundown, a mess hall, a clinic, or a dorm stood where there had been mud that morning, a tiny town assembled overnight. No crane is needed. No specialized engineers are required. That was the point. A handful of 6 to 8 soldiers, a wrench, a hammer, and a stack of corrugated panels could raise a whole hut in a day. Bolts clicked into place. Plywood ends were nailed on. A roof became shelter. The genius wasn't flash. It was relentless, usable simplicity. It was a quiet display of America's logistical power. It was a staggering display of America's logistical power. The nation wasn't just shipping an army overseas. It was shipping its entire infrastructure, rolling sections of corrugated steel, standard bolts, and frames, crates stacked like building blocks on Liberty ships. Factories hummed, assembly lines churned out identical panels by the million, docks loaded prefab towns as if loading cars. In days, a muddy clearing became a functioning base. Barracks, mess halls, repair shops, even hospitals. Whole communities rose with the tide, but that mechanical genius had another side. For the men living inside, the Quonset's practicality would prove both blessing and burden. For the soldiers and sailors who slept under those curved shells, the Quonset hut was a mixed blessing, salvation in steel, and a bargain with discomfort. It kept men out of the mud, out of foxholes, out of the rain and wind. It arrived on a crate and became a roof in a day. But that roof had its costs. Thin metal that sang with every storm, walls that offered no privacy, seams that leaked, floors that stayed cold and damp, and a sameness that pressed on a man's spirit. Still, inside that imperfect shelter, soldiers found small graces, a nail to hang a photo, a cot to fold into order, and for many, those small graces were enough to fight the daily battle between utility and comfort. It was a mixed blessing. At night, the hut's thin, corrugated steel roof turned into a giant drum. Every tropical downpour struck like a batter with drumsticks, and the sound swelled into a deafening roar that made sleep impossible. Men lay awake as sheets of rain pounded overhead, voices swallowed by the clamor, every bolt and seam rattling like distant artillery. Some wedged blankets against the walls, others wrapped their heads in jackets. Mostly they learned to go on less sleep, moving through the next day gritty and slow, grateful for the roof but paying for it with exhaustion. By day, the Quonset became an oven. The uninsulated, corrugated shell soaked up the sun and re-radiated it inward, turning bunks and boots into hot metal and sweat-soaked canvas. Men who'd slept through artillery found themselves roused by heat, stripping down to shirts, propping doors and windows open, fanning with rations wrappers, chasing whatever shade they could carve out on the plywood floor. Iron mess pans radiated like coals. Temperatures trapped in that curved tunnel left bodies drained, tempers thin, and sleep a distant mercy. It was brutal and painfully ironic, because that same cold, thin metal would betray them in winter. On the other side of the map, in the freezing European winter, those same stout little shells became iceboxes. The corrugated steel that kept out monsoon mud now stole every scrap of heat, sucking warmth straight through its ribs until breath fogged in the air and breath condensed on the walls. Men who'd sweated beneath the sun were now huddled in layers, sharing body heat and a single tin stove, waking to frost on their blankets. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. The hut that had been salvation in the tropics now demanded improvisation and grit just to keep the cold at bay. They leak at the seams, rain finds the smallest gap, and webs of water map the floor, pooling under cots and soaking boots left to dry. They rattle and groan in high winds, the corrugated metal singing like a drum and turning every storm into a sleepless concert. They offer zero privacy, dozens of men stacked cot to cot, with blankets brushing, helmets on shelves above, conversations reduced to whispers, because a cough or a laugh travels the whole length of the hut. It's hot one day, freezing the next, damp and echoing and awkward, every man living inches from another, forced into an intimacy he never asked for, and yet it kept them out of the mud. And yet, for the men who slept under that curved skin, the Quonset hut was less a machine and more a shelter in the truest sense. It wasn't fancy. It leaked, it rattled, it burned in heat and froze in cold, but it kept rain off your head and mud off your boots. It gave you a dry floor to lay a cot on and a wall to hang a jacket. Those small certainties, a place to stow your pack, a nail to hang a boot cut through the chaos of combat. In a war that stripped the world of predictability, the hut offered a sliver of ordinary. A soldier remembers the odd, grounding normalcy inside that corrugated shell. Rain could roar and metal could ring, but inside a Quonset you could do something ordinary. Drive a nail into the plywood and hang your boots, your photograph, a makeshift calendar. Little rituals lining up a cot, stowing a pack turned chaos into routine. For a few hours the war receded to the walls around you. It wasn't luxury. It was a tiny, stubborn claim on normal life. A place to pin something that said, "I was here," and a promise that tomorrow you'd wake under a roof and not in the mud. A soldier who'd spent weeks in mud and gunfire remembers the simple ritual like a prayer. Set the cot, snap the blanket, slide your pack under the plywood shelf, and hammer a nail to hang whatever little piece of home you still carried. The hut didn't fix everything. It didn't stop the thunder of shells or erase the smell of diesel and rot. But for one night, just one, you could fold yourself into something orderly, something ordinary. You could sleep without digging into the cold earth or crouching in a foxhole. That small, stubborn pocket of routine felt, against all odds, like safety. In the chaos of war, that small comfort, that slice of predictable order was worth more than gold. A nailed peg in a plywood wall, a cot lined up just so, a pack tucked underfoot. the luxury of a dry floor after days in the mud. Those tiny routines let men shave, write a letter, share a cup of coffee, and sleep without listening for shells all night. They weren't trivial. They steadied nerves, preserved morale, and made soldiers feel, for a moment, like ordinary people again, human enough to keep fighting. Those comforts would quietly give the humble hut a larger meaning. The Quonset hut, that unadorned ark of corrugated steel, quickly stopped being just a building and became a symbol, a physical shorthand for American presence, efficiency, and a strange kind of comfort. From the jungles to the frozen fronts, those curved shells announced, "Americans are here, organized, supplied." They were visible proof that a faraway nation could project order into chaos. To the men inside, a cot and a stove felt like normal life. To locals, rows of glinting arches signaled supply lines and power. Ugly, useful, everywhere the Quonset hut stamped the map with America's footprint. They lined the newly built airfields in China used by the Flying Tigers. Under those curved shells, mechanics kept fighters flying, and crews found a dry cot after a long patrol. Corrugated steel became a makeshift hangar, a parts depot, a radio room, everything a ragged frontline squadron needed, packed tight and made fast. It's the same steel that would soon shelf the beaches of Normandy, proof the hut could go anywhere. Just days after D-Day, the curved steel shells of Quonset huts started to dot the beaches of Normandy silver arcs, thrusting up among sandbags and barbed wire. Crated on ships, they were unloaded, bolted, and standing in hours by small teams with wrenches and hammers. In a landscape of chaos, they made quick little towns shelter, supply points, and the first whisper of field hospitals to come. Within days of the landings, those curved metal shells stopped being just storage sheds and became emergency hospitals. Crews ripped open ends, dragged in cots, and turned plywood into operating tables. Surgeons worked under corrugated roofs with lamps and whatever kit they could scavenge, nurses moving like clockwork between stretchers as wounded men arrived in waves. Crude, cramped, and cold, they were also life-saving makeshift MASH units, where skill and speed, not comfort, stitched thousands back together. During the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, a Quonset hut's simple wood-burning stove was more than furniture. It was survival. Men came in frost-numbed and exhausted, hands still clumsy from cold, and crowded around that small circle of heat. The corrugated shell did nothing to stop the wind, but the stove gave them warmth, coffee, a place to dry gloves, and share a word. In a landscape of frozen death, that little furnace turned a curved steel tube into something like home. Temporary, imperfect, but literally life-saving. It's a small detail, but one that kept bodies warm and spirits whole. It proved its worth everywhere, from soggy airstrips to frozen forests, on coral atolls and windswept beaches. One simple shell became 1,000 different things: barracks, mess halls, field hospitals, aircraft bays, chapels, command posts, whatever the front line needed, fast. Rain hammered the corrugated roof like a drum. Snow piled against the sides. Tropic sun turned metal into an oven and winter into a freezer, yet the huts kept men dry, tools safe, and operations moving. They weren't comfortable. They weren't elegant. But when speed, strength, and adaptability mattered most, the Quonset hut delivered. By the end of the war, American factories had hammered out more than 150,000 Quonset huts, a staggering output that turned an awkward prototype into industrial-scale infrastructure. Crates and crates of curved steel left assembly lines, loaded onto ships, and scattered across every theater of conflict. What began as a handful of experimental shells had become a rolling inventory of shelter, ready to be dropped, unpacked, and bolted together by small crews. The number isn't just trivia. It's proof of logistics made physical. Whole tent cities, airfields, and hospital wards built from stamped steel, the kind of mass production that changed how an army lived and fought. By the end of the war, those curved steel shells dotted every theater on storm-swept islands, snow-battered fields, and hastily cleared airstrips, forming a patchwork of sudden, usable space. They sheltered millions, sleeping soldiers, wounded men in makeshift ORs, mechanics keeping planes flying, cooks feeding hungry units. They let supply depots spring up overnight and command centers function where none existed before. They took the weather's worst so troops could do their work. It was unglamorous work, but decisive. The Quonset hut moved the logistics needle and, in countless small ways, helped tip the balance toward Allied victory. It did exactly what it was built to do. Not pretty far from it, but reliable, portable, and brilliantly simple. Crated by the thousands, snapped together by exhausted hands, those corrugated shells became roofs over millions of heads, workshops for mechanics, surgical bays for medics, and dry, level ground where chaos had ruled. In the brutal accounting of war men, material, and miles, the Quonset hut was a clean solution, cheap to make, fast to move, easy to raise. Its genius wasn't style so much as fulfillment. It let commanders stop worrying about shelter and start winning ground. But that very perfection, once the shooting stopped, would become a new logistical headache. The war was won. But victory brought an awkward, almost comic problem nobody had planned for. Everywhere the Quonset huts had sprung up islands, airfields, training camps, dusty bases now stood empty. Temporary architecture, multiplied by the millions and scattered around the globe. In 1945, the military faced a logistical riddle that had nothing to do with bullets or ships. What do you do with hundreds of thousands of lightweight steel shelters built for a single purpose and now suddenly surplus? Dismantle them? Store them? Sell them off? The very thing that solved wartime chaos threatened to become peacetime clutter. The war ends. The guns fall silent. But everywhere you look, little curved metal eggs dot the map on Pacific atolls, battered European fields, deserts, and home ports. What do you do with over 150,000 surplus, temporary metal buildings scattered across the globe? Do you scrap them? Melt them down? Leave them to rust on distant beaches? Each hut is a crate, a certificate, a problem. They are too many, too far-flung, and too useful to simply abandon. The military faces a choice that feels strangely civilian: dispose of war's infrastructure or find a way to turn it into peace. This is the hinge in the story, the moment the Quonset hut stops being just a piece of military kit and starts to become something else entirely. An answer to a peacetime problem nobody had planned for. The fighting winds down, transport ships return, and suddenly a vast inventory of simple steel shells sits unused around the world. What looked disposable in 1944 now looks oddly valuable in 1945. The battlefield has shifted from beaches and jungles to small towns and university quads, and the question changes from how to shelter soldiers overseas to how to shelter returning families at home, fast, cheap, and in massive numbers. The war is over. Victory parades and headlines aside, a new catastrophe was unfolding at home, a massive, crippling housing shortage that swallowed cities and suburbs alike. Millions of men and women came back from battle, eager to marry, to study, to start families, and there simply weren't enough homes, apartments, or even rooms to go around. Construction was slow, materials were scarce, and entire neighborhoods had been frozen by war production. Long waiting lists grew into desperate lines. Colleges needed dorms for vets on the GI Bill. Suburbs strained under sudden demand. What had solved one impossible problem overseas suddenly left America with another. The war was over, but the country was just getting started. Millions of GIs came home hungry for something they'd fought for. A life, a family, a future. They weren't drifting back empty-handed. The GI Bill handed them tuition, training, a ticket to college, and a shot at upward mobility. Young veterans rented rooms, enrolled in classes, married, and imagined lawns and careers. Problem was, there wasn't enough roof, floor, or foundation to meet that sudden demand. Campuses swelled. Suburbs strained. In the space between promise and shelter, a strange, pragmatic opportunity began to appear. Back home, the war didn't end with a sigh. It arrived as a tidal wave of young men with uniforms in hand and dreams in their pockets. The GI Bill unlocked colleges and mortgages, and overnight campuses swelled while new suburbs were planned on paper. They needed roofs, they needed kitchens, they needed neighborhoods. Builders and local governments scrambled, but lumber, labor, and lots were all stretched thin. Waiting lists grew longer, families doubled up, and dorms overflowed. It wasn't just inconvenience, it was a social emergency. Millions ready to start lives, and almost nowhere practical for them to live. Suddenly, the humble, surplus Quonset hut, once a forgettable tool of war, looks like an ingenious solution to a problem it never intended to solve. Steel arches that were meant to be disposable are cheap, plentiful, and easy to ship. Men who'd lived in them already know how to put them up. Colleges starving for dorm space, returning GIs hunting starter homes, and cash-strapped business owners all see the same thing: instant shelter, fast assembly, and a price nobody could argue with. It's a strange twist, the architecture of mobilization sliding seamlessly into the architecture of domestic rebuilding. Practicality, not prettiness, becomes the new currency. When the campus boom hit, universities hungry for dorms showed up at military surplus auctions and bought Quonset huts by the thousands. Cheap, prefab, instantly usable schools lined them up and created whole new student neighborhoods virtually overnight. It wasn't pretty, but it was fast, affordable housing exactly when colleges needed it most. Universities, desperate for housing, bought the huts by the thousands and unpacked them like Lego overnight. Whole neighborhoods of gleaming corrugated arches sprouted across quads and empty lots. Rows of curved steel became tiny apartments, kitchens, and playrooms. Corridors of plywood and bolt-lined seams where students, vets, and their new families set up stoves, cribs, and desks. They called these clusters cradle cities, a nickname that was half joke, half promise. Laundry lines ran between the arches, bikes and baby carriages cluttered the paths, and beneath the metallic drum of rain, these makeshift communities pulsed with ordinary life. Study, work, fights, lullabies. It wasn't perfect. It was home. Many veterans came home knowing how to build one. They'd slept under its corrugated roof, tightened the bolts in the dark, and found order in that simple arch. So when the government sold Quonset huts cheap at surplus auctions, young families and returning GIs snapped them up as starter homes, affordable, sturdy, instantly livable. They patched the seams, added wood stoves, nailed pictures to the plywood, and turned utilitarian metal shells into oddly cozy houses. It wasn't luxury, but it was a roof and a place to raise a child and pay a mortgage. That same familiarity would soon inspire others to repurpose them into shops and diners. Enterprising Americans, seeing an opportunity, turned surplus Quonset huts into the backbone of post-war small business. Chrome-trimmed roadside diners with neon signs glowing off curved steel, cozy neighborhood movie houses with a single projector, grease-stained auto shops with concrete floors laid under the arches. Cheap, sturdy, and already familiar, the huts were perfect low-cost shells for anyone with a wrench and an idea, bridging wartime pragmatism and peacetime entrepreneurship. Across America, farmers saw the same practicality soldiers had appreciated in them. For a few dollars apiece at surplus auctions, you could buy a steel arch that would shrug off rain, rodents, and the seasons. Cheap, durable, and easy to move, they became barns, garages, poultry houses, pump houses, workhorses of the farmyard stacked with hay and tractors instead of cots and crates. Built to be temporary, many outlived their intended lifespans. Decades later, you can still spot their curved silhouettes on back roads and fields, quietly testifying to an invention born for war, but stubbornly useful in peace. What began as a throwaway solution for war slowly wove itself into the American map, not as a neat monument, but as a scattered, stubborn network of curved roofs and metal ribs. Quonset huts popped up on campuses, farms, main streets, and military lots, repurposed into classrooms, barns, diners, garages, and cheap student housing. Veterans recognized them, entrepreneurs rewired them, towns adopted them. They were quick to build and cheaper than brick, so entire neighborhoods and impromptu cradle cities grew up around those steel shells. Meant to be temporary, they instead planted roots practical, imperfect, and quietly enduring across post-war America. They were never meant to be permanent homes, and people noticed. Families grumbled about the thin steel that let heat in and cold out, about rain that pounded the roof like a drum and turned every nighttime storm into a sleepless concert, about seams that leaked and floors that creaked, and those impossibly curved walls that made hanging a single straight picture feel like an architectural insult. Privacy was scarce, insulation was a joke, mornings often smelled faintly of metal and damp plywood. Still, the complaints, loud, valid, stubborn, only underscored a simple truth. These huts had been built for necessity, not comfort. To a generation rebuilding their lives from scratch, the Quonset hut was more than metal and bolts. It was immediate shelter and a start. Cheap, durable, available. You could move in the week the paper said you were hired, hang a crude picture on plywood walls, line up a cot, and sleep without mud under your feet. It wasn't elegant. It leaked, it rang in the rain, it hugged heat in summer and surrendered cold in winter. But it gave people something rare after years of war, a predictable place to eat, sleep, argue, and plan. In that chaos, stability mattered more than comfort. What's striking is how those wartime compromises didn't disappear with the last troopship they evolved. The Quonset's DNA is everywhere. Prefab panels, modular kits, components designed to nest flat and travel cheap. Think IKEA's flat boxes and Allen wrenches, same impulse, different scale. Think modular disaster shelters that can be trucked in and snapped together in a day, same promise fulfilled for civilians. It's a quiet legacy, a design language that values speed over ornament, repeatability over uniqueness, and practical democracy over elite taste. A temporary military fix became a blueprint for how we house, furnish, and rebuild in peace. It began as a practical fix, a disposable piece of military kit built to solve one brutal problem: shelter. No elegance, no permanence, just corrugated steel, a handful of bolts, and the promise of a dry floor. In war, those huts saved sleep, sheltered the wounded, and let entire bases rise almost overnight. After the guns fell silent, they kept working. Student dorms, starter homes, diners, barns, imperfect, noisy, oddly comforting. Meant to be temporary, they became stubborn fixtures of post-war life, a reminder that sometimes the simplest, most utilitarian ideas outlive the crises that created them. It started as a pragmatic answer to an impossible wartime question, something cheap, stackable, and fast, so soldiers wouldn't sleep in mud and rain, and in the chaos, it did its job brilliantly, bluntly, without fuss. Then the war ended, and those same curved roofs showed up on college quads, farm fields, and main streets, recycled into student housing, diners, garages, tiny starter homes, ordinary lifeways built from military surplus. There's a strange poetry in that. A disposable object becoming a fixture of everyday life, a tool of war turned scaffold for peace. But what does it say about an idea when its simple utility ends up outliving the global crisis that created it?